Good evening, all the participants. So welcome back, and good morning, Patrick. Thanks a lot for your 6 remarkable lectures. I think it's like a review and it's a introduction review for the parametricism. So that's a great. Also, we're looking forward to see what will be the next for Jaha and for Patrick. So it's very interesting. Goes to the last lecture, the topic, the social function of architecture. And also Patrick gives some keywords for this lecture, goes the function system and the functional exigency of society. Architecture design a social function system, framing as social functions of architecture, definition of situation as precondition of social interaction, framing as overcoming double contingency. Double contingency radicalize. Comparative metrics of function system. So we're looking forward, Patrick, give the lecture tonight. So the screen is yours.
Thank you, Philip. Welcome everybody again. This is the final round. Yes, I will talk about the societal function of architecture, but I decided also to contrast it with the societal function of art and make the distinction or demarcation and separation of architecture and art one of the topics. I also thought at the end of the lecture I will add some illustrations, also some illustrations referring back to what I've been talking about in the previous lectures, or also things which came up in the Q&A. So I pulled out some illustrations. So I will keep the beginning relatively short with respect to the societal function of architecture, and then make that more of a summary lecture. And I hope we can have a nice Q&A at the end as well. So that's my program. Let me try to share my screen. I think that's the one. And by the way, I should just close some things. Okay, so yes, so that's the menu for originally for this lecture, but I will cut this somewhat short because I've touched on some of the things. The idea that architecture is one of the great function systems, and parallel to the political system, the legal system, the economy, but also I will come to the art system, which is now separate. That'll be a particular topic of this lecture, and then I will spend just a few minutes on this particulars of the societal function of architecture as this, what I call it, the framing of social interactions. And I mean that, of course, the spatial, morphological, phenomenological framing of all interactions and situations, because it's important that when we're interacting in space, that the various social situations we might be entering or moving through are defined and recognized through the spatial framing, through the way the space is organized, articulated, looks and feels. That's the way we understand where we are, because every single interaction takes place somewhere and is specific for particular actors who are invited or who are joining. And once you join a space, once you enter a space, you're entering a social situations, and you cross that threshold, the social situation changes and new rules of engagement apply. So when you're in a public street or sidewalk and you move into a private court, forecourt, you have different rules of engagement, and you move into a foyer. Depending on the degree of publicness or privateness of the building, you have to now be more circumspect. You have to maybe greet people, etc. Whereas in the public space, you can sit down next to somebody in a public park, in a bench, and you can totally ignore them and pretend they're not there. That is not possible obviously in a private living room where you have to recognize and communicate. So these situations also, whether in what kind of situation are you in a formal work meeting, a board meeting, in a casual encounter, and but also, so you can read that off. You can also be prepared to this. You know where you enter and what to expect, who to expect, and that's the definition of the situation, where it's very, very important, because and the ordering and separating out and connecting up of this vast and increasingly larger and larger amount of possible social situation you could engage with. So let's just say you can think about the totality of society and the societal process as the panoply of different interaction types, each of them specialized to achieve certain things, to make certain decisions, to get certain types of informations, to be more casually meeting new people, to exchange, to purchase something, etc. And in each situation, it's framed by the architecture. It also orders sometimes the actors, the person behind the counter, in the seminar room or lecture room, the speaker versus the audience, etc., etc. So there's a structuration, but also a separation to some extent, and definition of the situation is very important. And each situation comes with a social protocol, but you can recognize and pre-recognize. You actually navigate the field of the city and buildings, its various spaces, like the text, with all these situational definitions rolled out and displayed for you to choose. And once you enter into and accept the social protocols as a premise for all further interactions. So everybody who has entered a space, in a sense, has followed an invitation and has accepted and signed, in a way, the house rules. I mean, it's not formally, but implicitly. And if you then join in the space and you move, for instance, in a private reading room in the library, you don't speak, you quietly sit down, you don't disturb people, etc., etc. So each space comes with its character definition, and you sense it, but you also aesthetically and where this place is located. So all of these and how it looks, whether there is hard surfaces or carpets, low furniture, high furniture, all of these are indications of the situations which are on offer. So that's basically the primary societal function of architecture, that framing of social interaction, social situation. And the same happens, in fact, with virtual media. There's also different zones and with different rules, different situations were framed in the 3D metaverse, but also in a 2D framing, or even through graphic design. If you go to a bookshop, the way the book is kind of articulated, there's a semiology also at play. You know, if you know what a trash novel looks like, super light with very glossy and tacky, you know, you can read the book by its cover. That's the designer, you know, characterizing and framing the content. And basically, you can see here, it's always also the semiological project at play. So, and what I'm talking about here, this double contingency, is you have to imagine, sometimes there's experiments, if you would withdraw all these spatial frames and semiological articulations, how would you know what's going on? I mean, basically my thought experiment has always been, imagine, I mean, a city of 1 million people, and imagine this is not so much about shelter. Shelter is a subsidiary and maybe less important and more primitive function, rather than the framing function, which I'm talking about now, which is an informational and ordering function. The shelter function is maybe solved. We have a very kind of benign weather and no wind, etc., etc. Nice, perfect outdoors condition, inverted commas. But you can also imagine an indoors, a gray rubber surface with no subdivisions, with no different materials and textures and shapes, etc., and you throw a million naked bodies onto that surface. Naked because, of course, we're also designing our exterior appearance. We dress up for a certain occasion. We emphasize whether they're male or female, whether they're ready for certain types of interactions, particularly where you go. If you go into the bar in the evening, we always dress up for the occasion and we're recognizable by who we are. That's also withdrawn. That's also design semiology. If you withdraw all of that, you can immediately see that so societal processes come to an absolute standstill because you don't know who is who, what's going on where, what to expect, where is what. And then you have this double contingency. If you would imagine back before we have the culture of developed and civilizations and cities, as another way to imagine an experiment, and you have two naked, let's say, primates encountering each other, or human beings in some kind of unstructured environment. Really, anything could happen. You don't know. It's potentially very dangerous. You don't know. Also, you cannot gauge and see what, and in a sense recognize and categorize your opponent. So that, and then whatever happens is totally indeterminate because there is no premise, no priming. That's a double contingency. You could start doing something, he could do something, and there's two contingent set of choices which are very, very large, and you have this double contingency which could go anywhere and has no order and no structure. So, but if you have an encounter in a civilized world, you meet in a certain place, and you can read off, let's say, in older times, the social hierarchies with a dress code. You know who can start talking. You know what kind of thing can be mentioned in this or that situation, and the topic or the situation is already predefined, and then you can go on with, working through and making that situation productive. So that's basically my theory of architecture and the design disciplines, because interior design is, of course, also framing, urban design is framing, but also fashion design, graphic design. Product design is also framing human interactions through a spatialized frame. So this is defining the situation. Certain apps, for instance, on the iPhone, they also come with certain, situational definitions to some extent. Okay, so that's what nearly, in a nutshell, that lecture. What I've done here, I don't want to read it all, but you can do something similar with all the other function systems. Basically, the idea here is that you have each of the function system is, in a sense, ordering the social process through, to some extent, you could say, define the situation more abstractly. In other ways, as ordering all interactions, for instance, are ordered by the legal system through sets of laws which apply and you can rely on, that are normally the stabilized expectations. They also clarify, that this double contingency is also enough overcome through that. For instance, and in the economy is also the economical system, in a sense, clarifies with respect human relations with each other, but particularly with respect to the world of objects. The economy ensures that clarifying the situation in terms of ownership, who owns what, and also that some items of ownership are up for exchange, and you can communicate with that, and you can transfer money, etc. So and all interactions, all situations, all relations are always ordered legally. They're always ordered economically to some extent. So, for instance, here I'm coming here. I don't know, by the way, too much about it because it's relatively low value, inverted commas, in terms of monetary exchanges. But I might have been offered some money for this, for giving these lectures. Some of the PhD students of the purchase some of these their studies, and then in the workshop you might pay to participate. So there's always at the background economic relations, legal relations as well, so that I shouldn't insult my students and I shouldn't plagiarize. so whatever, and all communications are always ordered by these various societal subsystems, including they're always ordered by architecture and design. So that's why there's not a single communication or interaction or human action which isn't framed by architecture, the design disciplines. So that's the key thing. But in this case, this framing is about premising and priming the situation. So it's the premise of all further communication. So then might you talk, or you might give a lecture, you might exchange some goods. It is framed already by, for instance, the design of the shop and the way things are structured and organized, and where you pick it up and go and pay, and in where the entrance and exit is, whether you're inside or outside the shop, etc. That might not be a door. This might also be just a certain zone, etc., established through the shelves, etc. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to I mean, is also every social interaction is framed somehow by a reservoir of knowledge, and if you rely on that, so the premises of our communications are certain knowledges, and if some of them become problematic and controversial, we can refer to the sciences and a specific scientific experience and research to clarify. So social communications are, in a sense, ordered or structured and framed by knowledge, circulating validated knowledges, which is continuously updated and provided by the sciences. So this is the way I'm looking at it. That's kind of the way my theory of architecture fits into this overall theory of functionally differentiated society. And I've gone through that here. Again, I've showed it a number of times, but today I also wanted to talk about the art system. And that, for instance, when I talked about the societal framing of framing as architecture's societal function, this was obviously happening not only in the 20th century. It started to some extent in the Renaissance, all through the discipline, through the stages and styles of architecture through the centuries. And by the way, the arts, like painting, sculpture, particularly the arts and crafts, what we now call product design, were in one discourse, in one system with architecture. So, you know, the space wasn't only designed there by an architect, but this was also decorated up by sculptures and paintings, which also was framing the situation. The painting would fit the situation and scene. You know, the ancestors in the noble dining hall, or the mayor's image at in the entrance hall of the city hall or something like that, and the key historical references and the memory. So the arts were functioning equally in framing communication situations, as well as some of the arts like painting were not so much, were partly later on picked up. Those functions were picked up by, for instance, the mass media, and in terms of its content. Okay, so that I will come back to this at the end of the second half of the lecture. So I don't want to go too much more detail on this with respect to the societal function of architecture relative to the societal function of the other function systems. But you know, it's primarily an ordering function, and ordering through delivering these nested and distributed and differentially articulated frames, which define in a way the spatially and morphologically and semiologically the totality of the system of differentiated social situations of engagement. That's very important to get things done, so that you don't come together and you know, and it's not kind of, not everybody's clear what's going on here and what's the agenda and how to behave. I mean, you have to learn and be socialized into all these situations and frames. And if you're not, and of course there are many situations we don't participate and don't know about, and we don't enter these spaces, and we know not to enter these spaces. Okay, so now I just wanted to, as I said, I want to illustrate some of the things we've discussed about, for instance, this idea of this radical innovation. And by the way, of course, the discipline of architecture has the societal function of framing, but my emphasis is continuously updating, upgrading, adapting, and innovating the system of frames and means of framing with respect to the continuously, let's say, complexifying and dynamizing societal situations we need to kind of keep framing. And here we have, you know, an avant-garde piece of architecture which is just trying out new means and ways of framing and structuring social processes and ordering. And this is, of course, not a super high performance place. This is a Parc de la Villette, where one could perhaps spatialize in a play way something which might later on apply to the cities, where there's more performative pressure. But even the park is obviously has social functions. And this is a fantastic idea. For instance, I said these broken figures, triangle, circle, square, is one system which organizes that park. Another one is that squiggly line, which runs across and captures everything. Another one is that grid of pavilions. And interestingly, these point grid of pavilions, and each of this pavilion is different. And have this kind of transformational series to some extent. And you can say it's a system of pure difference, but maybe not. Maybe there's a certain trajectory, the way they've been generated. So I haven't studied that much in detail, but let's assume it's usually in deconstructivism, former postmodernism, a manifold of pure difference. So in that case, whenever you, and I don't have the top view here at this point, wherever you put your finger or wherever you land and drop into the space, you have several options of how to describe your location and sense of where you are. For instance, I'm dropping here. I could say I'm at this bend on the squiggly path, or I'm in close to the center of the circle, or I'm next to this axis. So that's another system. Or I have to project down. I am at pavilion XY. And I'm at all of these places at the same time. And depending how I describe myself, it has to do with what my purposes might be, what I'm focusing on, what is my foreground of attention. If I want to meet somebody at the pavilion, I mean, to have a one-to-one kind of date, then I will talk about this pavilion and let's meet there. And if it's a group of people who want to play a volleyball, then they're locating themselves in that circle perhaps, and maybe they play across these two lines and don't care. I said yesterday that a person also different, let's say, sports field painted on the same surface. So that was a Parc de la Villette, powerful. Described how my whole generation of students jumped on this, and the next day we did we did these designs like this. And I want to show another inspiration which came up few years later, is this idea of folding and these kind of transformations, deformations, and pleating of a surface which articulates out of different zones and subzones, and they're more continuous. It's the Eisenman 1991 Frankfurt Rebstock plan, and then the inspiration for something like Darcy Torsten, that we can distort and manipulate, and this is the parametric variation of a genotype-phenotype relationship. So that's been influential. And this one that I mentioned yesterday, that in '93 I was teaching at Columbia University with Zaha, and I mean that Tschumi thing of layering was prominent. Of course, Bernard Tschumi is the dean of Columbia at that time, and you can see here that we did this layering. Tschumi had maybe 3-4 layers. We had 12 layers, and these layers were, I mean, they're not here distilled and isolated already, always several over each other here in this diagram. They were, they were squeezing, they were differentiating, they had a dynamism and global differentiated order in each layer, and then they tried to be nested and not just radically superimposed. So we started to develop it also on the computer at the time. So you can see here these are kind of gradients and radiating transformations. There's certain fields, conditions, anyway, it's relatively primitive and it's quite chaotic, and the correlation which we try to do isn't maybe very sophisticated. They're still quite chaotic. But that's just wanted to mention that this was this idea of, which now in parametricism comes through, is parametric variable elements. They form systems. These systems have a global differentiated, continuously differentiated field condition, if you like, and then when they layer each other, they have to start inflecting and respond to each other and recognize each other somehow through being informed by each other. So that project we called it ubiquitous urbanism at the time. So it was an abstract urbanism. It didn't have a site, although that would have been also of interest as in an initial given layer. Okay, so I just wanted to also show this briefly when it comes to my theory of styles and talking about ordering processes. So if you look at the various styles, and we're starting with the vernacular, and then all the epochal styles we were talking about, with some of the transitional styles like postmodernism, deconstructivism, what we can actually see, two things. The one thing is that with every advance from one epochal style to another, there's an increase in degrees of freedom, increasing options of generating a design. So, which also means that the different designs which come out are much more versatile and diverse, and the designer has more degrees of freedom to address, functional complexities, site conditions, more ways of having more ways of generating forms, because society also has many more situations to define, let's say. So that's degrees of freedom. Now, when it comes to order, yes, I think that when you move from the vernacular to the Renaissance, there's an increase in order. And actually also, if you go up from the Renaissance to the Baroque, there's an increase in overall global order. So a complex like Versailles has more sophisticated ordering. It uses curvature, it uses scale and local asymmetry to generate global symmetries. So I think we were, in a sense, in a good positive trajectory where we were both increasing degrees of freedom and order. But then as we move further beyond the Baroque, we're going to classicism, with neoclassicism, in fact, historicism. Basically, each time we're gaining, and we have to rapidly increase degrees of freedom, because from the Baroque into what I call, the bourgeois or laissez-faire capitalism, particular we have many more. That's the moment, for instance, of Durand. We have many more different types of buildings to design. In the Baroque, it was only the church and the palace, and now we have other institutions, ministries, museums, universities. I mean, it's still mostly public buildings, and Durand has this idea of a combinatorics of elements, and you still have regulating rules, clear symmetries, but also you have this kind of grid. You have an underlying grid on which you can play these components. So you have more degrees of freedom. You can generate through that combinatorics many more types of designs. So it's an empowerment, but the designs themselves they're slightly less well ordered and predictable than the Baroque, where you really, from the local detail, you can infer where you are on the global nearly. Through also a stricter, when you start to use this convex, concave, these symmetry and proportion work through more detail. And here you have more the modular component game, although it's still regulated by symmetries. When it comes to historicism, you get a much more degrees of freedom. You can choose actually all various styles of the past. So somebody like Schinkel can build a church or a town hall in a church in the Gothic style. You can do a town hall in a neo-Romanesque style, a medievalizing style. You can do a courthouse in Neo-Graecan, Neo-Doric, let's say, style. So you get a lot of options, and then the overall city environment, in particular, is has more diversity. The design has more degrees of freedom, but the urban order is much less strict and defined, and so legibility and orientation starting to become a problem. And also the aesthetics was the aesthetic of the picturesque. So if you compare the Baroque city with this maybe a more loose agglomeration of all sorts of stylistic expression building, yes, it's easier to identify. You can recognize the Gothic is probably the town hall and the church, and the neo-Baroque is maybe still the palace, but the austere neo-Graecan, these are the state institutions and so on and so forth, and the neo-Corinthian is the museum. There's a semiology at play with respect to the various styles, but the overall order is declining, and now we go moving to modernism, an absolute explosion of degrees of freedom, throwing out symmetry, throwing out proportions, throwing out ornament, and opening it up to these kind of very stretched, slender proportions. Symmetry is gone. What they have instead is ponderated equilibrium, like a mobile. There's a kind of compositions were held together by something which is called a ponderated, by an implied balance between elements. That's quite interesting. It's often overlooked. They're not kind of random asymmetric compositions. They're usually trying to balance. And if you go to IIT or the Bauhaus, they started as the Mies and IIT, they teach you how to make a composition which is balanced, which somehow has the function to still show what parts belong together, those which revolve around that center of gravity. There would be another lecture to show that, but there's an enormous amount of difficulty in modernism. You have so many different parts. The Bauhaus has the workshop, looks very different from the administrative building, from the classroom buildings. You have an open composition. You can add things. It's not complete, so you don't know where the building begins and starts. You don't know when many of these modernist buildings come together, you don't know which volume belongs to which building. Because also when within a building you could have quite different facades, so you're really getting the unity of what belongs together gets very confused, so you have a disordering effect. And postmodernism exaggerates this, because now you can bring in all the different styles, you can collage more wildly, and you lose more sense. You get more differentiation, even though more difference is expressed. Different lifestyles, different classes, different categories, different types of, they're not all fitted behind relatively simplistic grids. So you get that explosion of diversity, but it's also becoming even more chaotic, and it's nearly celebrated like this collage city. So we keep increasing degrees of freedom and deconstructism as well. Now you can start superimposing, and you can use you can leave behind even, let's say, the traditional motifs, which are still in postmodernism, and you can be more wild and inverted commas out of control compositions. The complexity is highly increased, more degrees of freedom, but further degeneration of the order. So this really becomes a point. There's a crisis point, I think, in terms of the disordering of the city itself becomes very disordered. Call it garbage spill urbanization that's the late 20th century already, and that we haven't overcome that. So and then when we come to folding, what is interesting, of course, degrees of freedom further increase. So as you saw, we do the layering, but we do more. We do suddenly gradients, we do splines, and we don't only have circles as curved. You have many degrees of curvature, many degrees of surface modulation, and we have an increasing repertoire. We can use blobs and splines and gradients and swarms of particles and swarmism. So the repertoire and degrees of freedom keep increasing, but this goes upwards at the same time, and particularly into parametricism and further into tectonomism, by the way. Degrees of freedom, well, that's another debate. Degrees of freedom, they're maybe slightly increasing, because you put a lot of constraints and rigor, but you also have more options to play with. When you suddenly can use Rhino Vault versus the max realization versus XYZ, you have more constraints. You still have more degrees of freedom, more options, and the ordering capacity is further increased. So it's this beautiful. Let's say here we get a negontropy, and we have entropy, which is something negative. The disorder increasing, while freedom had to be increased, and freedom has to continue to be increased. But we have now the kind of negentropy, the organization, of reorganization of the built environment with higher and higher degrees of order, simultaneous increasing degrees of freedom. I think it's a wonderful place to be in. Of course, how is that possible? It's possible through computational systems primarily, which allow us to for instance, spin out these network dependencies or dependency relations, and we can control mathematically through complex algorithms a whole arrays of elements which are perfectly ordered according to an algorithm, something which we're totally out of the capacity of previous generations. So we have a beautiful positive, and no longer so much that trade-off. There's an underlying trade-off between order and freedom. We can have both win-win, order and freedom. So I thought that was a good point for promoting parametricism, and I have to continue that graph and we can think through together with taxonomy. So, okay, so one more reason to fall in love with parametricism intellectually, and then you should say you should also love it. You should acquire the intuitive emotional appreciation and love for it. So you have an internal aesthetic revolution. Okay, so aesthetic revolutions. I mean, these innovators, this what Zaha's done, explosion, these kind of squiggly of the hand. I mean, but what is interesting about the fast hand movement, it's a law of physics. It's a kind of centrifugal, centripetal forces fade. So this is not a car crash or something kind of disordered. It's something highly ordered, let's say, as well as perspectival distortions. You take a whole array of things and you put them into some kind of perspectival vanishing point relation. That's an ordering principle which grabs many pieces, and however they look like, they're brought into a global order. Landscape analogy. Landscapes are not random garbage spills. Landscapes are, physically structured, the self-organizing, lawful, rule-based entities largely, and that analogy comes in, and then we're developing architecture like inorganic and organic nature. We have a lot of rule-based evolutionary processes that all brings up order and in simultaneously with degrees of freedom and overall complexity, complex variegated order. Okay, so we need to learn to love these. I mean, it's not so difficult to love these because we're familiarizing us. We know nature, and we can kind of tie in the contrast, which was always architecture versus nature, is now not so much a stark contrast. It's more like learning from nature and affiliating. And a lot of these tools, a lot of these beautiful algorithmic tools, are actually coming out of science simulations, natural processes, fluid dynamics, etc., bringing them into the design repertoire. So it comes indirectly out of nature and the process of nature. And of course, you can then kind of spin them beyond, with respect to the parameter setups, beyond, the natural phenomena, which are a small subset of the, let's say, algorithmically simulizable. So aesthetic values represent condensed experience, and there's a shortcut substitute for analysis. So if you learn to love and you can recognize, let's say, and it's easy to recognize, for instance, the Baroque building versus a Renaissance building, and you can then quickly know that this is going to be the more sophisticated, maybe the larger complex, the more powerful institution, the more advanced place, and I'm drawn to that. I'm moving to the Baroque city, basically. Or in the contemporary condition, you're moving away from these monotonous, outmoded, old-fashioned, modernist cities, and you go into something lively and rich. Let's say the postmodernist city was more vital and lively, more complex, and that what used to be perceived as ugly in terms of, let's say, a complexity, and you now see certain beauty in it. And when you and this way you can kind of identify intuitively the vital through this shortcut of just recognizing it through its appearances. That's very, very important. Okay, I don't want to read too much today. So the idea here is that beauty is a promise of performance, and with natural and familiar organic bodies, that's kind of a non-brainer. But also, maybe we have to also adapt this. Maybe this has a certain beauty, it shows performance, or maybe it's the wrong performance in contemporary condition. Maybe they're way too, and they use too much energy, and what's really the point? And we should find that light and cute electric vehicle more beautiful. So we also have to relearn our sensibilities. There is something, you know, universal invariant, perhaps about aspects of beauty. If you, you know, in human organisms, symmetry, a perfect symmetry, proportions, something, some ideal type is interesting. I mean, I will come to this. I was saying, you know, it's order versus chaos, and I mean, it's very simple. I'm sorry I have to show this, but what the ugly is in some cases, I mean, it's obviously the destruction of order and functionality is perceived as the ugly. But then beyond that, we have ideals of beauty which are moving and transforming historically, and we're expecting something different from, let's say, the female half of the population, and there's still, of course, further revolutions to be had on that one. But also, if you think about ideals of beauty and you move through, I'm comparing different villas, you know, the Renaissance, the modernist, parametricist, and you see there a transformation. Just, I mean, very obvious across all domains of life. You have that revolution of aesthetic values, and the argument, of course, that there is performative advantages in as you move up here, and that's independent fact of, because this is way more, it was way more luxurious than this at the time. So we have to abstract from that. Order versus chaos is the thing, and the order is very different, and maybe it's the more sophisticated, harder to grasp, more indirect and more complex order which society is developing. And there's also pockets of disorder, garbage spill, urbanization, etc. So we need to be sensitive to complex, very good order. That's my thought. Even though there's a red thread with all these radical aesthetic transformations. So these are radically different phenomenologies, which speak to very different senses of, let's say, taste which we acquire. But there's maybe an underlying red thread, order versus chaos, but with an upward trajectory of complexity. Okay, so I mean that this is ugly is clear, you know, compared to a beautiful designed car. There's this kind of randomness, you know, or like a garbage spill, things thrown together, things getting destroyed. You know, I don't have to say much to this, but what is curious and interesting, you know, in the search for new sensibilities, you know, Himmelblau was talking about the aesthetic of the car crash, inspiring them, and, you know, architecture must burn. So there's also, you know, informal abstraction in Pollock, but I would say, yes, I mean, it's hard to find some of this beautiful, but if you look at this kind of splash, and the later on the way Himmelblau developed, there's a certain intricate, complex order in these kind of splashes, and we've been recently working with splashes, ink splashes, to develop interesting, dynamic, legible cityscapes, for instance. I mean, because it's like Zaha's idea of explosion. So I don't think that there's much success in just seeking the disorder. I mean, temporarily, when order isn't available, before parametricism was available, you temporarily, in the interim, you know, you have to reject that rigid order of the modernism. So maybe disorder, phenomenological disorder, is better because we don't know how to order that new level of complexity. It's a better image. You should be attracted to the chaos of Tokyo because we don't have anything better. At least it's not the sterile monotony of, you know, a Moscow suburb. So to even that, you have to temporarily maybe learn to love the chaotic, the disorderly, to be drawn to the right places, to be drawn to the right environments, and follow those crowds who are gathering in the chaos of a collage city. So I want to now come to what I said briefly, and I will be trying to be quick. So art, because of course there is, you know, I'm showing here Jackson Pollock, you know, this kind of chaos of the ink dropping, but there's also, then you can see further, although this couldn't have been easily done used in architecture at that time, you'll see there's, even with those ink splashes, although there's some kind of random head movement, the way the ink itself sprays and flows has as an underlying physics self-ordering. It's something we now are sensitive to when we've been through some years of experimenting with things like fluid dynamics, storm formations, etc., etc. So modern art, I just wanted to show, I mean, what is modern art, contemporary art? Is architecture still part of that? Is architecture an art form? And I say absolutely not, because art, the art world, what we call the art market, the art world, the art institutions, contemporary art galleries, the documenters, the Venice Art Biennales, that's what I call the art world, and not, you know, let's say, really historical new phenomenon. That's will be my argument. And there's a kind of strange crisis. It's something so strange and so different. Whereas before, as I said, painting, sculpture, and architecture were unity, generating functioning spaces or functioning information, and they were critiqued based with their purpose, whether they could fill their purpose well, etc. There was clear criteria, and also a functionality, a utility element to all art up to the 19th century, where it starts to transform. So then when architecture was part of the art, now art is something very, very different and radical. It still speaks to, we're still interfacing with art, but you have this, that the crisis was already reflected within art after, let's say, 1917, you had these strange things like cubism and abstract art had emerged a few years earlier. Things cut loose. There was a puzzling, what is all of this? And you start critiquing. Art could be anything. So this is Duchamp's fountain pissoir saying this can be art too. If some kind of Kandinsky squiggles can be art. And then it was further radicalized in the 1960s. So there's a kind of mystery and puzzle about what is art? Does it mean anything? It's crazy, but there's so much attention paid to it, and it had this fantastic pedigree. It was so important part of culture. And in 1962, for instance, you have Yves Klein. He actually did some of these conceptual performance art gestures where he was, you know, for instance, here is throwing money into the Seine and said, I'm selling my artwork to you. You can witness the destruction of value, you know, or he was burning money in front of the purchaser of that artwork, which is the burning of money. Or you have Daniel Buren a few years later, another famous French architect, opening, I mean, his show. By the way, a guy who was radically declaring in the I don't know when, in the mid-60s, that, you know, I am now for the rest of my career only drawing stripes. And it seems to be something very banal, very stupid. And in a sense, for me, it's a gesture saying, you know, art is meaningless, it's nonsense, but I'm predicting I'm going to be a great artist. And he has been for 30 years selling stripes for millions of pounds. And, you know, people, it somehow bought into it, and now he maybe he's living of it so well. There's this kind of surreal, absurd, or this sort of absurd gesture of exposing the utter meaningless, supposedly, of art, saying, I'm not going to do the most stupid thing, but I'm going to rigorously, I'm going to become a wealthy, famous artist. But in this case, early on, he basically, his show is closing the gallery. So there's a gallery behind the doors, and the opening of the show is the closing and shutting the gallery for the period of the exhibition. And the outside, he's just put stripes on the outside. Anyway, so that's just to show, wow, there's a mystery. Even within the art world, there's a large part of art production only exposing what seemingly meaningless thing as art. It seems everybody's, you know, idiotic to pay attention to it. Is even more idiotic to pay millions for it. All thing is some kind of strange scam, Ponzi, absurd, which expresses a kind of alienation and self-alienation of society in this kind of bizarre condition. So that's not my view, by the way. I just wanted to point out that there is this mystery even within the art world itself. They don't know in this. Nobody knows what is it for, but we're buying into it, we're doing it. So we have to develop a rationalizing theory of art, which can kind of explain to us why is this investment in the art world worthwhile, important? Why can there be no modern civilization without an art system? A contemporary art system is a necessary ingredient of a progressive contemporary society, world society. That's my thesis, and I'm explaining to you, and I hope you will buy into it. So in this case, just one of the glimpses how you can start to understand the meaning of art and how it functions is, you can see it in the style. Abstract art of a Mondrian picked up as an inspiration in a Theo van Deursborg, making abstract three-dimensional compositions, moving on to architectural composition, and then a built form Rietveld, and there's this kind of shifting planes, lines which could continue forever, drawn out to the edge into infinity. And so it becomes something where you can play and openly play in composed space. So this idea was also moving from the idea of architecture as building an edifice to architecture as shaping space. And nearly is like shaping space, framing, space, you could nearly say. So there's a way more abstract concept. This is something which interfaces with abstract art. It's not like architecture is designing a school, a palace, a church, and we know what they like, what they should look like, and you're just designing them, just make them the right, you scale up the symmetry and proportion and choose the right ornament. No, it's generating or making space. In German, Raumgestaltung, that was the insight. Actually, it was reflected already in the late 19th century, some art theorists, and that became reality in modernism. So again, there was a theoretical anticipation of modernism in this case, some of the key categories. So that's what you can see, this abstraction of planes, and they could become anything, and they don't have to, there's degrees of freedom, you can feel them. How many degrees of freedom of playing with these surfaces you have? That's this kind of large degrees of freedom. Anyway, and then you have, Mies van der Rohe's brick house playing the game inside-outside relations. And Kiesler said, well, the spatial city, you read this large. So again, as I said, these houses, this is a manifesto for the whole spatial city. And similarly, you have more complex level. This one became much more mainstream and modernism through the decades. This one had to wait for, let's say, deconstructives and Zaha, because there's already hints at superposition, etc. But you have the Browns of Elisitsky starting to be three-dimensionalized, and the Leonidov architecture. So that's what that's the meaning of abstract art. Even if they didn't know it, the societal function of this abstract art was that it was opening up a new universe of compositional possibilities for designing spaces, cities, products. That's really what redeems the work of let's say, Malevich is redeemed and made sense of retrospectively by Elisitsky and the Leonidov, because those would have been possible with the Malevich, with that idea of free creation, leaving precedent behind, leaving mimesis behind. Mimesis was this key concept of art, where you're mimicking nature, maybe you're mimicking, rehearsed tropes and sujets and ways of painting. And similarly in architecture, it was some kind of mimetic. You were just kind of repeating versions of previous, types which seem to be inviolable, and then say no. And art if art is no longer mimetic, it starts the canvas as a plane of free creation, unconstrained creation. Of course, it wasn't totally unconstrained. You can see that there's certain rules. If you look back, look at from Pollock back to Mondrian, you see, well, it's not. There's certain things which were never tried. There were certain a prioris, even in abstract art, in a Kandinsky, etc., etc. Anyway. So that's the way to look at art. But art the works themselves, when they were created, you know, the works of a Picasso, the works of a Paul Klee, the works of a Piet Mondrian, of a Malevich, I mean, these guys were mystics also. Maybe they had some idea what they're up to. We don't know, but we don't care. They had no purpose, seemingly no function, no utility at all. So that makes them so puzzling. Why should be into them? Why would I be investing a career in generating lines and color fields on canvases which have no purpose? Well, it had a purpose, you know, in a larger cultural field, because it has inspired and used also the gravitas of that tradition of painting. And there's a kind of gradual transformation out of, you know, painters which were major, you know, utility generators, and then photography pulled that away from them, and they kept going and had to reinvent new things for themselves. So they were this kind of pedigree, which meant also attention is paid to these, you know, what's going on these canvases, and they became this. Anyway, so the old arts like painting, sculpture, architecture have evolved into, I mean, let's say we now have, let's say what art used to be painting, sculpture, was the mass media, photography, movie making, as also graphic design. I mean, basically graphic design has a societal function which painting used to have. You know, drawing, illustrating books, documenting historical events, you know, like a photography or documentary, so that they were very, very, you know, embedded in useful production. Now, as all this thing was withdrawn from the artists, they were kind of free floating, and they had to find something, or maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Anyway, they kept going. But I think it's very important to have that free floating chamber of brainstorming, which is what I call it now. So something unprecedented, a new sui generis institution has emerged alongside the new media, the new design disciplines, you know, so on and so forth. And that is modern contemporary art, the artwork, the art system, which is not, you know, of course, the artwork has rejected that idea of utility, you know, absolutely. But somehow it mirrors all these creative design disciplines. So you have, for instance, video art. Now, what is video art? I mean, does it have any purpose? Is actually anybody able to watch video art? Can you go and watch kind of 3 hours Nam June Paik? I mean, it's nearly impossible. So it's basically, it's clear that something like video art is only watched by other artists, curators, as well as filmmakers, who maybe find new repertoires, new techniques, new effects, which they can incorporate into their movies. And these movies are real utility necessities for society to reflect on its, you know, continuous upgrading and shifting mores, and how to live a mature life, and how to solve, you know, family relationships. So movies, we all need them, we all watch them. This the mass media, it keeps playing. In documentary films, we need those. We need to be updated. You know, the system of the mass media has the function of continuously updating our shared worldview and bringing us all onto the same page, and that's very important. But video art plays into this, feeds into this, and maybe also there's this aspect in where there's photography is either documentary and useful, but there's also art photography, which maybe inspires the really useful photography, and that in itself doesn't have that purpose. So that's what I'm talking about here. Art in contemporary sense has lost all its immediate usefulness. So what is the societal function of this new art world? And my answer to this is, well, and first of all, I will come to what my answer is. I'm hinted at it already. It's a kind of there's kind of totally unconstrained, crazy brainstorming chamber where you don't ask for functionality, so you can generate stuff which somebody else might see potential functionalities in. But first of all, to show you and to prove to you that architecture was part of the arts. Wait 1 second, I have to. you know, that we had actually all architects were at the same time painters and sculptors. And, you know, Alberti, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Bernini, Schinkel, and so forth. And I just prove it to you. This is obviously, you know, that Michelangelo, but also what is less known, that Raphael was an architect. This is his architecture. So it was part of the same thing, because he also painted the frescoes inside the villa, the sculptures, decorating and framing the particular social situations, etc., etc. So, but modern art means this radically new thing. Photography brought on this crisis particularly, and the societal function was kind of withdrawn from the artists. I don't want to go through all these texts, but so basically we have the arts and crafts, painting, sculpture, and then the crafts, and they continue, most of them, all of them continue as design, media, graphic design, film, photo, product design, architecture. And then something spins off. Some of these kind of painters in particular and sculptors, they became the art world. Because somehow we don't use much sculpture and contemporary world in the real life as useful things, right? So that became the art world, and that's that freewheeling platform of experimentation. It's a radically new phenomenon, and it is very separate from architecture. But avant-garde design is feeding from it, because they're trying out new technologies. Internet art, I was mentioning this, or they're trying out new. There may be also some of the new technologies, 3D printing or interactive actuation, sensing, etc., installations, various art installations. They also try out new political message, forms of political messaging, new stances. There's a lot of experimentation, and there's no pressure for this to function in any way properly. It's only maybe displayed somehow and for inspirations. You engage with topics, and you may be but you're not writing a critique, you're not doing a documentary. But maybe inspiring documentary work, etc. Performance art might be influencing later on also theater and film. So that's what this art world is doing, and it's so difficult to understand because it refuses purpose and just this pure kind of expression, pure stuff, and engaging and being. There's still criteria. Novelty, originality is the only thing that counts. And then you also see that this is the experimenting, the brainstorming chamber. In a brainstorming session, you don't necessarily critique immediately, or everybody's free to throw in whatever, unconstrained, and that's very important. That's very good. That's very helpful. And if you put too much the kind of pre-rationalized and demands on it, then it doesn't come out. And I said, even within architecture, you have this doodling phase, this kind of strange phase of maybe brainstorming internally, and then look at art, and you can be tolerant for a moment, but then obviously it has to start functioning, and you can't show a client some kind of spill or spit, as it were. So that's the art world, I think, and every modern society needs it, because the pressure of innovation and the search spaces, and we unprejudiced kind of going out there and trying things. Also human interaction. How can we speak to each other? What can we do with that? You can try it in absurd theater. You can, there's also parts of theater which are more art. The Almeida Theater in London. Nobody can kind of sit through that and consuming it as entertainment or infotainment. Just purely the specialists, experimentation. I think contemporary highbrow theater has this character often. And we need that. We need that for for everything, basically, and engaging with new technologies. So that's my theory of art, the brainstorming chamber for everything here. Everything feeds off art and feeds back. So the fashion designer who isn't successful, who tries out things first, actually you can, from everybody here, architects, they go into the art world, and we did, Zaha did, and we did it, and several others, they can convince the gallerist, convince a museum, convince somebody to that, and then when you're in there, you can't talk about it, why you're doing it. It's just pure expression, pure genius, pure novelty, pure originality. But Zaha, of course, wanted to never be confused with art. She said, no, these paintings aren't art. The gallerist wanted to show them next to other paintings. Is it fair enough? To get resources and continue the work, yes, but the discourses have nothing to do with each other. What the art world makes us think is misunderstands me totally. I want to be part of the architectural discourse, and for me these are projects which with an arc towards utility, which art blocks. So in a show that the Bauhaus had this initially integration. You have these characters, you have Moholy Nagy and you have Hannes Meyer and Gropius, and then you have these strange characters, Itten, Oskar Schlemmer, etc. And they were integrated initially from the old conception, and later on they were eradicated. So you can see here that artists are refusing to be proper, classifiable, determinable in terms of purposes and usefulness. There is kind of strange it's a system of mutations allowed to exist in a space, and as all evolutions need not only reproduction and proliferation, they need mutation. So it's a mutation chamber of the world society, and we need it. And you can see how different, I mean, can you, it's like, they, of course, they're refusing to take any responsibility. It's a radical if they had responsibility, there would already be their proliferation of potential novelties and strange, ideas would already be finished. So it's very clear that we have nothing to do, inverted commas. We are very different players with very different agendas, discourses, internal cultures, expectations, and criteria of success from the artists. We are different. But then we can go into the art world. I was mentioning on Fox the other day, and then but hopefully we exploring things which are deeply promising for architecture. But in the art world, they don't look at it like this. So you have that schizophrenia. They're radically distinct, but there's an interesting interface. But it's important because all the different function systems, however radically separate, their interface, they respond to each other, they service each other. We service the art world by building them frames, building the museums and galleries, and they service us by driving certain inspirations into our field, etc. So I will stop here and open the debate.
Hello, Patrick. Nice Philip here. Well, maybe let me raise the first question, and as while we're waiting Philip to come back. I think you're absolutely right in kind of clarifying the difference between art, avant-garde design, and mainstream. And you also said, well, eventually, I think in his kind of developmental progress, parametricism is aiming to become the mainstream. So after parametric, for example, let's become the mainstream, how it could continuously kind of bring those kind of, well, let's say, get the feedbacks from the arts to itself to continue its adventure.
Yeah, I think there's still innovation. So I would distinguish between revolutionary periods where the innovation is through generating a new paradigm, which you have multiple competing avant-gardes at a certain point, but usually in that brainstorming chamber you have different things kind of flying around, and maybe they're weeded out, or you try one first and then this inspires another through these transitional styles. But before the transitional styles, you have a brainstorming chamber with different figures which never maybe built a small movement even. That just kind of sparks. And so, yeah, so then we have that once we become mainstream, which is obviously important, we get many more protagonists in, many more architects, many more problems. We see also new issues. What happens if you really can build at scale a whole district, all with different parametricism, tectonism architects? How would they interface? Can they fulfill that hope that they respect each other, try to affiliate and connect up with each other, resonate with each other, etc.? But I do think so. I think first of all, this will be also a deepening, a maturing It will accelerate technological investments. It will also research and development. We will be deeper within the paradigm. So it will be shifting, let's say, away from art inspirations into more, I'm not saying that will stop, but into working with science closely, with engineering, with social science, simulations, etc. This kind of idea of evidence-based, that will come more developed. And let's say if you look at mature modernism, it has very strong connection with suprematism and abstract art and the style and so on. Later on, it didn't so much. You know, if you look at high tech and the later modernism, the connection with art weren't so strong. There was a moment actually where in modernism it didn't much to do with you know, you had informal abstraction. Pollock didn't speak to, you know, let's say a Norman Foster or something like that, you know. But where it came in interestingly was, you know, postmodernism had a certain, I think, inspirations from pop art. So in the revolutionary period, I would say the art becomes dominant because that experimentation, avant-garde experimentation, is very similar, and philosophy comes in. Whereas in the later stages, it's more sciences, social sciences. And in the revolutionary period, you have art and philosophy. Now, I don't think it will totally stop, and because I think there's a lot of innovation, cumulative advancement within a paradigm. Also remember there's the opportunity of subsidiary styles. And so innovation continues, and to some extent you could say there's new avant-gardes, but they promote a subsidiary new style. So I don't think it's about, you know, just bleak rolling out. It wasn't modernism more like this because the society wasn't so dynamic. Mechanical mass production, there's a lot of rolling out thing. In the parametricism condition, I think there's going to be more like continuous innovation, cumulative, more science, more evidence-based, but also new technologies, new algorithms. There's a huge space of development, AI coming in, and that generates this new subsidiary styles, I believe. For instance, with AI, you're much more in a game of looking at existing oeuvres and hybridizing them, etc. And so that's what I foresee. And art can come in. Yes, art, for instance, AI, it's a typical thing. So the artists are playing with AI early on. Now it's more in the commercial graphics, which is taken over the AI. But I think early AI experiment, you could expect similar to early internet. But then at a certain point, when the thing is matured to a certain point, the mutations obviously only rarely generate innovations, right? Most of mutations are some kind of wasted sparks. It's a bit like, you know, also with investment, all these new companies that investment VCs, they invest into 100 companies and hoping that 3 or 5 come through, you know. But in art is even more, like maybe the 1% of this comes through. But I think in revolutionary periods, more comes through. Mutation has a bigger play. It's the Cambrian Revolution, where, you know, where it's new speciation. So I don't think there's no role for art, but it's harder for a non-strategic, more artistic, intuitive approach to contribute, or their material contributing to something highly evolved and highly sophisticated, but it's not excluded. I mean, I think architects should keep looking at the art world in particular, because they have the freewheeling, that the capacity, there's sometimes big budgets should just follow intuition and grab onto a new technology like, you know, AI. So I wouldn't exclude it, but I think it's receding, and maybe, but I'm hoping for these new phenomena, these new things like new challenges which generate subsidiary styles. So for instance, we've also been talking many times about the metaverse. That's an opportunity. There's a lot of fresh playfulness, and I think that could be, I wouldn't be surprised, I'm not sure there are some art schools and, let's say, professional artists. I mean, those who are working on art schools, some of them might do metaverses, but they will do it in a kind of non-utilitarian fashion. but maybe precisely because they do the non, they might throw something up which can be used usefully. That's what I'm saying. In a sense, in a strange way, Eisenman and Kipnis are like artists integrated into a profession because they're refusing utility and generate stuff. So there's some kind of strange nugget of involuntary architects or somehow artist sensibility and modus operandi of artists specializing as being the mutation machine within our field. So that's also a possibility.
Oh, okay. So my second question, just thinking about those kind of new avant-garde brings new kind of challenges to parametricism. I really want to ask what's your kind of insight on this kind of triple O tendency, especially in the States.
Yeah, so triple O, for instance, I mean, a lot of challenges to parametricism are coming from regressive movements. I would call them reactionary, even if they're coming from the left, where they want to go back to basics, go back, down to earth, where they want to, moralizing stances. I don't think they are avant-gardes. Maybe they seem to be generating a new little movement, and there's even this kind of neo-postmodernism, there are these strange things. At the moment that these retro movements, they feel fresh, because we've been looking at for this for a while, and now somebody digs something out. I don't think it's always necessarily unproductive, but probably it is, because we've been there, we've gone through all of that, and that we have evolved out of that for good reasons. So what happens after the retro postmodernism? Are they becoming retro deconstructivists and then retro parametricists, and then they catch up? I mean, so what are we expecting out of it? So a lot of that anti-parametricism is actually reactionary, and whether it comes from the left or not. Sure. So I think that's an important point. But triple O, for instance, is an interesting one. Actually, triple O is eerily similar, and I do find it productive in the following sense. So in the late 90s, we had that moment in the development of parametricism, and that wasn't called parametricism yet. So outer folding, blobism at the time. Later we had this idea, there was an idea, AD on hypersurface.
Yeah.
You saw this projection, and you had these kind of crazy textures, and the geometries were becoming crazy, and you had the discourse on virtuality. I mean, Deleuze has been so productive, right? Initially, the rhizome, that's where I first read Deleuze in 1987, actually, at School of Architecture in London, and then it became obviously smooth versus striated space, with this gradient that's fluid, no rigid boundary condition. We had abstract machines methodologically. We had so many things. The assemblage, which is this kind of body without organs, not an organized structure, but where the pieces connect, disconnect, reconnect, refunctionalize. There were so many fruitful things out of Deleuze, and eventually there's this concept of virtuality coming in, and that's basically the key concept still in disguise now with object-oriented ontology, in my view. This idea of the excessiveness of the object, the intransparency, the inexhaustibility of the object, is precisely the Deleuzian concept of virtuality, which is distinguished from the potential and the virtual actual. Virtual is that open-endedness, that inexhaustible potentiality, which isn't the potentiality is something more or less, one of these three things will happen. The virtual is a condition where we don't know, we only know it's kind of thrusting forward. Actually similar to in fact the art, these kind of artistic random mutations, we don't know where the sparks fly and where they catch on. That's the condition of virtuality. Now that's precisely what the virtual house competition, for instance, this was, we had people in the discipline who were direct disciples of Deleuze-Guattari, like Brian Masumi.
Yeah.
Later on also Manuel de Landa, but Brian Masumi was the protagonist of this idea of a cut, what the articles were called. It was also to do with sensuality and virtuality, and there was a virtual house competition with John Reichman. Basically, the idea here is this, that the strategy of virtuality is nearly like an aleatoric, I mean, you just generate excess formal material randomly, and it's so rich that you can then go in and find things and read things and use things. It becomes an aleatoric process of appropriation. So the virtuality is full of these, randomly meaningless, but maybe things which can acquire meaning. So you have these highly rich, distorted, fragmented, and they were not necessarily objects. And that's the only, I think, addition in the, the SciArc Triple O projects. They have these strains mushed up internally, convoluted, crazily enriched with textures, pleats, and colors. What is that? That's precisely the Virtual House project at the time, the way it was promoted. And I believe into this. So we get these kind of escapes of discovery, and always said, allow some degree. I mean, it's not about the hyperspecificity only within parametricism. It's default conditions of differentiation. So, and then let the faults, and then you can self-sort people into the various conditions, and then but they're already pre-ordered to some extent. So this idea of openness and withdrawing stereotype conditions, withdrawing typologies, similar in a sense the moment of the early 70s with Softscape. And you remember that piece, ocean, TV Sotoma, strange landscape, faceted landscape, where you can gather in unpredictable ways, and you're invited to go there. That's the moment of appropriating the virtual. So that's precisely what Triple O is about. It has a kind of another rewriting of the same script. So I was saying, wow, interesting. I've been occasionally emphasizing, because we've been asked them, aren't you over prescriptive, over tailoring, always adapting, and specifying out? No. Well, yeah, you're right. And now we know we need to these zones of indeterminacy, where and also, by the way, we're not predetermining, we're just generating algorithmic differentiation. And then of course you want to also make it the right differentiation with respect to what you know, but you also make it just, not random. I mean, yes, to some extent indeterminacy, space of indeterminacy. And the same was Eisenman had the space of becoming. He started to layer his multiple grids. I mean, he just generated things. And then you have this kind of thing where you basically coffee cup reading, or the aleatoric method where Leonardo uses the paint, the watermarks on the plaster wall surface, generating landscape, and he sees this profile landscape, he sees that lake, he sees tree formation, Max Ernst, frottage, décolleté, he says these two plates where he spills oil around. This is nearly something which we're doing now with algorithms. So, and that's an inspiration. So that's the virtual. That's I say Triple O is basically an interesting reminder of something we've gone through in parametricism, and we should never forget and remind and reintegrate. But it can't be the whole project just be this mush. I think with that, it's not competing, but we can, even in parametricism, even to some extent, tectonism, zones of indeterminacy, zones of play, for instance, where that inspirational play, where you tease yourself with a doodle, automatic writing, say, what have I done here? That could become this. When you, the real society should do that with some of its spaces. And that's this idea of appropriation, of indeterminacy, of self-organization, of generating meaning, not preconceived, but post-occupancy. And that's, I think, what I see rational and progressive and meaningful and important in the Triple O project. It was all already there, good reminder, but it can't be the whole project. And don't do it as an isolated object. I don't see that being the thing. It could also be continuously open-ended and non-bounded field of virtuality.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think Triple do provide some kind of enrichment of differentiation, but I think they gone too far to looking for the strangeness. If you really think architecture as a kind of communication system, you do need a kind of familiarity to really keep that information solid and ready for the general public. So I think that's.
But it's a good, yeah, exactly, and it should be certain. You know, a certain percentage is good of indeterminacy, and that's definitely something which I find productive, and that is what they call the, you know, the inexhaustibility of the object. In my interpretation, because you can't pre-exhaust it. It will always surprise you. Potentially, the object confronts you, has other possibilities. It is not, you can't domesticate it fully by the preconceived purposes you've routinized and established for it. It will escape that interpretive capture always. I mean, that's just, I mean, as an ontology of abstract philosophy, I mean, I'm a skeptic that, you know, again, actually, this kind of philosophy for me is exactly the same relationship with proper, let's say, political science, social sciences, or other engineering and architecture. So this philosophy and art are they're operating on the same plane. Recklessly irresponsible with respect to what the utility of these abstract algebras of terms. Here we have abstract algebras of formal spatial stuff. Here we have abstract algebras of terms. They're like each other to some extent. Actually, triple O is very popular in the art world, and no triple O philosopher, as far as concerned, has any significant position in any significant philosophical faculty in the world, right? So you know, they end up in architecture schools or in some kind of, I don't know, provincial.
Yeah.
So so that is an indication. Actually, triple O speculative realism is some kind of, is very similar to art, and it has no chance in, let's say, in most professional philosophy conditions. Although even that spark is also, some sparks might fly into professional philosophy as well, and or social science, and trigger something. So I think these are the mutation machines. And you know who theorized it best was Deleuze and Guattari. The self-conception of their own project was precisely what you're seeing in speculative realism, which is basically, they're saying things like this: take the 1,000 plateaus, is this abstract machine similar to the Eisman strange graphics, rule-based graphic, and it means whatever you do with it next. It's a, you know, that's that book, that piece, all these topics, catchphrases. It's totally unsystematic. It's seemingly stream of consciousness, and it means to whatever you make of it. You can't actually misinterpret it, because all it wants to be this proliferating engine of mutation, which becomes obviously in this useful eventually. A lot of mutations are useful. I mean, otherwise, how would we evolve from an earthworm? That's what I mean. But of course, the majority not. But it's interesting that this, of course, Deleuze and Guattari's work isn't a random production of words. I mean, it draws things out of the sciences and social science and new political movement. It has a lot of contemporary things. It abstracts off those purposes and generates an abstract algebra, but it has this kind of, it's pre-charged with a lot of, it's a good heuristics of generating a let's say a mutation machine, because it's not a random selection of terms. It's a kind of condensation of, you know, of complexity theory, of latest biology, of latest social theory, of interesting revolutionary movements like the autonomia movement, of anti-psychiatry movement. It has a lot of progressive, pulls out progressive content, but it abstracts it to the point of view that it can be reused everywhere, with, you know, and reinterpret, and you have to fill it in. What the abstract machine is in architecture is not, you can find and lose the answer, but you can be inspired and make analogies. And by the way, all innovation is analogy, metaphor, seeing things, you know, in what you're doing with what others doing, and then you can try to draw out, and you look at the help. These are the heuristics. Analogy and metaphor is a huge heuristics of innovation. Anyway, so that's the way I see triple O. I don't see any other major movement or formation which I see progressive, but I don't see anything beyond parametricism and tectonism at the moment. I see, as I said, lots of retro and an interesting, productive reminder, which I think we should heed to, we should learn to. But I think so. I recommend the article I've written about it because it also answers a lot of challenges, and it also answers a challenge which I often, for instance, I was once challenged, and since it's part of sometimes my lecture, what about poetry? Poetry is similar to this kind of artistic moment and even every new project could have something. I mean, some kind of spark. I mean, I'm talking about instrumentalization all the time of everything, and even the art world, etc., in an interesting way. And by the way, the art world shouldn't know that has this instrumentality. It will hamper it. It will burden its consciousness. They need to be freakishly free. But I think it's important that that when I talk about this instrumentalization, I don't mean 100%. I mean 85%, 90%, and 10% freewheeling spark within the project, and maybe more, because if you look at Google, for instance, a company like this, they're planning, they have job descriptions, they have allocations, but they have a lot of free time, they're saying, and you can self-organize. And which projects you might find a project and bring it to the company, you have 10% free time. Maybe that's a good measure. Maybe you have 10% freewheeling mutation in our project, and by the way, we probably have much more. So, involuntarily, but I think it's an important reminder to also to call for that, and the sense of being inspired, having something innovative and different and other, otherness is still a value in art. It's originality, or you're dead. There's no other demand. Novelty is it. We still have an element of where we want to be original, but it should be an innovation. It should be something original, which also is better. But that might be controversial. So we still kind of say, anyway, we have antennas which always make us curious with respect to novelty. Novelty is, for the avant-garde in particular, is definitely a value. Of course, it can't be just, it at least spending a few minutes, it sparks our curiosity, and we shouldn't miss it right away. Anyway, so it is, I mean, that we have utility and beauty, but I did say, and I didn't say that here, but in my writings, I have that's the mainstream. The avant-garde has novelty, utility, beauty, or originality, utility, beauty. So there's a kind of triple code. And there's a similar, let's say, if you look at the sciences, originality is important, not in mainstream application in engineering, or in educational textbooks. They forget about who did it first, and this is only about what works, what's true, what's probable, what's applicable. That would be the mainstream aptitude. But in the avant-garde, in the science itself, at the laboratories, at the frontier, it's of course you validate originality.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Phil, we want to take over. We also have some questions from Gabriela. Oh, no, not Gabriela. So sorry, Daniela. Sorry.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I have Gabriela in my workshop, so sorry.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question, but then also I want to propose a thesis and see if you want to challenge it. The question is regarding the freedom order diagram. And the question is, why do you consider modernism to be equally as disordered as vernacular design? Is that assumed on an architectural or urban scale? And what do you say to the argument that the grid was an equivalent ordering device to parametric network dependencies, even if the results were not quite as legible? So I wrote that early on. The thing I'm probably more interested in the response to is a thesis regarding cinematics. And I would argue that film in cinematic form, so not experimental film necessarily, but films with plots and script and etc., is as complex and ordered as urbanism, complete with form-function relations on a trajectory of complexity that manifests a programmatic brief in the form of script action, and a substrate of socio-spatial communication that unfolds in time. And I'm wondering if you would argue with that, because I don't really consider cinema an art. I consider it much closer to urbanism and architecture, and especially the way that it's starting to unfold in the metaverse. So those are my questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually with the graph, I wasn't so much paying attention whether when modernism comes down, slides down into disorder, whether it overtakes or not vernacular. I'm just looking at the direction of travel. And yes, it would be more in the urban, but I have a lecture where I can show you, for instance, I mean, even in something like the illegibility and this, you know, the difficulty of reading a modernist composition in something like the Bauhaus. It looks different from the back, from the front. You don't know if you're still looking at the same building. Particularly when several buildings comes together, you really don't know which part belongs to where and what. And so, but yeah, I don't know if it's more or less than the vernacular. So I wasn't paying attention to. So that's over reading. It's a little bit into the diagram there, but you're right. I obviously had to, by default, place that dot somewhere, and I didn't look left, basically. But I couldn't. It's hard. These things are not easy to measure. But what is relatively easy to say is whether a shift in style leads to an increase or decrease of order. But you can't quantify it. So it's an ordinate relationship. It's a comparative relationship of more or less between adjacent dots, basically. But unfortunately, because you're plotting it into a graph, you can read more into it. Now, comes to cinema, yeah. So what I was thinking is, of course, you're absolutely right. Movies are very highly ordered and structured. You know, particularly also brought onto an interesting formula, which is another sometimes I think so interesting in terms of the 1.5 hour movie with certain kind of rules of unity of plot, although compared to TV series, for instance, where you have always multiple intersecting plots, and the way you structure plays a plot, the way you underline music, it became very, very interestingly stereotyped in the early 1930s, or actually, if you look at a movie from 1931, 32, and you look at a movie from 2022, if it's still a cinema movie of usually 90 minutes, the structure and ingredients, including things like close-ups and flashbacks, etc., etc. It's as tightly structured stereotypical solution as similar to the car. The automobile also emerged in the 1920s, looking like some kind of horse carriage with wheels, and cohered into a final optimized form in the 1930s. And look where we are now. Nothing has changed. The four wheels, the upholstery, there's fine, and it's really interesting to reflect. So on Le Corbusier's theory that he said, he had this wonderful description of where you have that moment of searching for the type, and that's this radical functionalism search, where the pieces come together and you develop a type, this type formation. What do you call it? Let's say functional type formation in something like a car or a house. Similar to the house, the minimum house. Actually, it was the 1920s where the contemporary apartment was established. Before, you didn't have really, you had these kind of enfilade series of rooms. They weren't unit, clearly. There was a whole family in one undifferentiated room, or several families, and and in the 1920s, you have precisely this. There's apartment building, this unit where you have the bedrooms, the bathroom, and it has all the component. It has the you know, living room, the kitchen, the washing machine, everything is there. And again, 100 years later, it is exactly the same. So that's quite interesting. And look, what Kirby said, okay, there is the engineer, and he thought this was still integrated. It defines the type, and then comes the artistic refinement of that type. So the type has been discovered, and now comes the artist and kind of articulates and refines. And he thought it is kind of modular, the proportional system, and the artistic. Yes, I think it's quite a bit mystical. It's that idea of the artist comes on the scene. But what is interesting for me is that this idea of formation of type and then the kind of refinement of the type. Anyway, so I'm not sure if I'm deviating a bit, but I don't think that cinema. So it's similar to the apartment building, this kind of typological formation. It's a complex structure which once you discovered, and you know, see, there's no point if family life hasn't changed. The nuclear family, with people who work away from home in 1920s is the same as in 2120. There's no need to change that. And so there's no willful transformation. And that's why I was so excited about co-living. That's radically different and new condition potentially, where you don't have that, where you have a distributed, dispersed apartment where you have a shared kitchen and a shared living room, and you work in that free cover. It's quite exciting because wow, for the first time in 100 years, on the front of residence, we have something typologically new, which is challenging us and interesting. So, but we have of course many other domains within architecture where we had fresh things, which were different. But residences were not one of them. Cars were not one of them, and movies were not one of them. Although the TV series is a very, very different animal. How you can unfold something across 40 episodes and so on. But I think one more thing, just because you can make the comparison, yes, between cinema, between movies generally and more an architectural project. It has, you can say there's different things. You plan your script, you fill out, you have, various things. You have engineers, you have art directors and so on. And we actually, some architects come in and design the sets and so on. But ultimately, it's a very different function system. So I absolutely agree. It's not in the art. Video art is in the art system, which nobody's watching. If you would poll how many people have watched any video art recently, for more, it's actually only artists and filmmakers. And so that's the relationship here. And movie cinema is in the function system. That's Luhmann's proposal. We can debate it. In the function system of the mass media, because his function system is what he calls the mass media role and function is to continuously update and establish and update a shared worldview. And I think good movies, and we need them all, we need to kind of continuously re-update. Worldview is not only knowing the news and understanding, and also listening to debates about understanding and evaluating the news and the various political, but it's also, the movies help us to evaluate and update ourselves with respect to possibilities of private lives or professional lives, and how to engage and how to juggle, multitasking and complex family relationships, etc., and so that's what movies are, this kind of things. And what is good about the function systems, we always continuously need them. Like we always have our doctors, we always go to the movies, we always live in architecture, we always, at least some of us have always some kind of lawyers. I had, unfortunately, that we always have the law at play with signing this contract, this advice, that advice. We always have political constraints coming upon us. So these kind of function systems, they continuously updating and framing what's going on in parallel. And at the same time, we're continuously watching the news. We continuously need movies, actually TV series. I haven't watched movies. I don't think movies are, so cinema, I don't know if you call TV series cinema, but, and so that's, I think I'm just using the occasion to display once more, Luhmann's way of looking at society. I think it makes a lot of sense. but they have different criteria of success. You know, the movies are about this kind of content, is upgrading our mores and sensibilities and etc. And how do you? So there could be an expert discourse in the mass media of how to, and of course then they're also inspired by art, as I said, similar to architecture. That's a parallelness, but ultimately they're obviously separate. Although there are some books about cinema and architecture. That's more of a kind of course, cinema uses and displays urban settings, and it's helpful for us to observe how, you know, maybe it's difficult for us to observe real life, or maybe our own life, but other people's lives. And if you trust the movie maker, that they have researched the topic, or they have antennas and intuitions, and you can see, you know, how life unfolds, or historically in a Downton Abbey or something, how a structure is organizing a complex social organization. That's useful. It's a bit like, you know, substituting for post-occupancy analysis. But it's a separate thing. It's more yeah, it's simulating the process in different ways, and not only focusing on the framing.
But I guess what I'm thinking is that in the metaverse, for instance, even though no matter how similar the actions are that we do in real life to what we're doing in the metaverse, like, so let's say it's a conference, we're still coming in as like a pseudo character, as avatars or whatever kind of presence. I mean, I would argue that even Zoom is a form of creating a, you know, a cinematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, of course. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to think cinema and metaverse and so on. Yeah, I think they're fundamentally different things. So you obviously have a lot of, let's say, animated movies now, where you particularly in the science fiction, I mean, you could say, well, in the metaverse sometimes is obviously, if you take video games, the problem, the confusion is maybe this. So you have movies, and then video games, some of them which are movies where you can invite it into the quest, or you can discover things, or you can direct the actor. And then you have the fantasy play, the cosplay video game is entering a movie. I don't know, I mean, there's this continuity there. So, and then the metaverse seems to be, you know, a lot of things which are called metaverses are, you know, multiplayer video games. And I say, well, I want to make a very, very strong demarcation and say, well, this is not useless, right? So I'm not dismissing necessarily video game. I don't know enough about it. My feel is, and so that is more, you know, gameplay is often, you know, you bring up children to learn social behavior by gameplay, and these are still teenagers. So I can't judge it, but it's different. So I think the metaverse for us is just an absolute continuation of real life. It's part of our social life, and it's continuous, and it will also, there will be these boundary crossing and merging and fusing and overlaying of the physical and virtual framings, but the life is a single life. It's a single continuous social life process. Maybe you have dissections in your life where you keep your private life separate from your professional life, others not, they bring their partners into, you know, even work with their partners, etc., etc. So I don't mean this, but inherently there's no distinction where you say in the metaverse I'm doing this, and in the physical world I'm doing this. No, I think in terms of knowledge economy and culture and learning and teaching and working together and collaborating, it's totally seamless. And the same thing, but it's very different from playing or pulling back and sitting and reflecting on other worlds and possibilities. And you could have, which you might do when you watch a movie and get inspired by this. By the way, when it comes to movies, I have no patience to fantasy and strange, you know, I don't know, I can only watch real highly realistic movies. They might have an edge of science fiction, but it needs to be credible, possible, and relatively immediate. So similarly in a video game, I'm not playing them, but the only thing I can kind of would entertain is something like Grand Theft Auto or something. But I don't know enough about it. So I think there's, of course, with movies you could have really bad movies where you don't learn anything about real life, and you're drawn and directed into your most base and dysfunctional instincts are pandered to. So obviously that's on another page. And I sometimes, my suspicion is that video games are not of the sophisticated and character forming type. I don't know enough about it. So that's the other thing. And of course you could also have, architectures which are not very conducive, but that's why with the relationship, definitely there is, first of all, a demarcation, but then of course there is, we can look and learn, maybe even from video games or from cinema and movies, helps us imagining what kind of social scenario we would like to play out in our buildings, what kind of milieus we want to cater for, and how these milieus function. It makes it plastic, it makes it vivid. And I sometimes thought that the agent-based simulations are more than focusing on functionality and social functionality, but in another iteration of this, when I started looking at agent-based simulations, and it was more of an illustrative condition. So it's a way where I thought what we also can do is to bring our buildings alive. If you want to imagine, yes, maybe write a little novel about it, maybe make a little movie of what kind of situations could play out, where you develop characters. I mean, it's a lot of work. We don't really have time and energy to always do this, but I use DRL for this and say, okay, make these scenarios and tell me what this family is and what they're doing, and make a little movie. I mean, in the end, you have to generate movies and see how the architecture, the elements, features, spaces structure the social process, how they become protagonists or obstacles, how invite new ways of interaction. So if you can imagine a social life, which we should try to imagine when we are working with clients and trying to develop a setting for social life, then a good way to do it, if you have the time and energy, is to not only in our head run this little fragmentary and movie in our head, which would be kind of closing your eyes and trying to sketch out and imagine a building. You really need all the drawings and work through. So maybe you also need to elaborate a movie to show to your client or to yourself all the situations you've imagined or might imagine, and discovering new roles and new ways the furniture should move. I mean, there's also linked to responsive environment. So in this sense, movies are the way of imagining post-occupancy kind of, that could be productive. Of course, the movies themselves,
that's what I was getting to.
The movies themselves, for themselves, they're not so focused on that, but we could use movies like that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting to. And the exciting thing in the metaverse, though, is as opposed to us kind of imagining that, we're kind of co-creating it with a population that's actually coming in there. And that's where the metaverse becomes a kind of a sandbox, like for, trial and error, kind of reinventing spaces as we reinvent the movie, I guess. That's kind of what I was
that's why it's also useful when the first people come in, they don't put the heavy those heavy high performance requirement interactions into it immediately. They do try them out most playfully. They don't, if you have a very serious negotiation, let's say, or you have a very very important event and a celebration or party. I mean we did it with Lieberland party. So but let's say let's say it might initially be more playful to get used to it before you bring in the heavy loaded and heavy important interactions into an untested medium. So that might also make it more playful at the beginning. It's a bit like that, that conference we might be doing in Lieberland Metaverse. First of all, they want to test it and see what it's like, but also it's not going to be, they have it in parallel. There is, and when we had Lieberland, we had Zoom in parallel YouTube streamed and running it in the metaverse. So there's a lot of going to be this early on trying out, and if you know, and watching realistic, by the way, not strange fantasy movies and video games using virtual spaces and how the virtual spaces facilitate interaction. We could maybe use that and study that. So in this sense, I think it's a useful field of experimentation, like it is for all aspects of life. So in the movies, all aspects of life are coming to play. So it also, although it's not foregrounded by the movie makers themselves, and it is also trying out and simulating the architectural aspects of life, are also simulated in cinema. Of course, oftentimes it's not very innovative, but oftentimes it is. Actually, I was personally inspired by some movies to become an architect, and also give you the whole feeling of what architecture I want to associate with myself. So it's basically the Jean-Paul Belmondo movie playing in Brasilia. I was so stunned, and I love these, you know. Or you should look at the Nouvelle Vague cinema in France, and in the 60s, these fantastic open villas, glass buildings, skyscrapers, which everything fresh and new. This world of cool, it's tied in with modern architecture. So that's come through, you know, in cinema as well. So yeah, that's why I learned my passion for modernism. Jean-Paul Belmondo, you know, moving very cool in Brasilia.
Okay, great. Patrick, I think really interesting. Today, actually, you addressed the theory into the art system, parametricism, and the history. I think why we invite Patrick here is because of parametricism already after 15, 20 years. I think it's like a review, and it's like representation of the theory from very starting early version to the, I think right now it's like rethinking on that and practice on that theory for 13 years. So from my understanding, I think Patrick's contribution is to introduce the social system, system representation into the spatial system. I think that's the initial logic Patrick analyzed in the past few days. And today, I think it's even bigger scope, including you mentioned what is the mainstream, what is avant-garde and artists. I think that is like a different motivation to put the practice or the critical research or the artworks into the history. So I have some, I think, very fundamental question to Patrick. I think as the Jaha practice over the past 15 years, I think it's the holistic, including artistic work, including avant-garde practice. You make a very meaningful theory and ADRL studio. At the same time, you're also the mainstream, I think, because of Jaha office. You have a big number of practice around the world. I think that's the mainstream right now. It's not avant-garde. So actually, what you're doing actually crossing art, avant-garde, and the mainstream. I think that's not easy to define what kind of theoretical perspective, because I think as a holistic style, I think in your presentation you mentioned from the Renaissance, Baroque and also Baroque after modernism, I think, and going to the parametricism is a kind of stylistic evolution in the history. I think parametricism, why we invite you here is because when we introduce a contemporary theory in architecture school, parametricism already there and it's in the history. So I think that's the importance of this lecture series. We have you here. But still, I want to have two questions to you. The first is, would you like to make some comparison between your theory and OMA and RAM? Because RAM also very interesting in the social system or social event space. So in his practice, I think it's kind of presentation. It's not like a differential or like connection, integration of the events, but it's kind of object. It's kind of representation of event space in the city. He also quite interested in this kind of social networks and the social behaviors. But actually the ways is quite different to yours, and the theory is quite different. So how would you like to address and make comparison in the history in your diagram of the evolution to put RAM? Where is RAM in your diagram? So that's the first question. And the second, I think what's missing in your theory is most importantly is, I think, ethical point of the global warming is kind of the planetary, like Benjamin Bratton, he put forward the planetary terraforming the planet. I think the discourse is quite based on not only the human and the social networks, human and social relationship, but based on the human and the environment. I think the environment is, I think, holistic view on the planet. So how would you like to address your theory between the human being and the nature? So I think that's also, I think, maybe missing in your presentation. How do you like to address your theory into that? So two questions.
Well, thanks a lot. That's very good. So yes, I don't think that architecture, I mean, that's where I'm coming from in terms of the philosophy and social theory of Luhmann. We have these domains of competency and the differentiation of discursive responsibility and professional responsibility. And it's interesting that some of the global warming issues, actually was curious that moral ethical issues are debated in society. They don't have a professional instantiation. So they are more free floating. They haven't, although it's some kind of discursive connective tissue, that don't have evolved a fully professionalized domain, morality. But it's not something which is, so that, and you could say, it's interesting that you're challenged, that every profession should reflect on that, because it doesn't get other discourses. So to reflect politics within architecture is, I don't think, it's a bit disingenuous. We certainly cannot originate and innovate politically. That we need to kind of, these frameworks, the political frameworks and values are coming from the evolved political system. And you can be a citizen and activist while you're being an architect, but your voice will be articulated through the political system, maybe through a think tank, through a political party, through your vote, and maybe when you make statements as a private citizen, not so much as an architect. Morality, perhaps equally. I haven't thought too much about it. I mean, it's not within, let's say, what is expected. It's not within our professional scope. So clients don't expect us to take a moral stance and criticize their project morally. They are the ones who have to sustain their, let's say, moral responsibility, particularly the large corporates or if they're public municipal clients. We don't lecture them on morality, but I do think that what the discipline has taken up is obviously the general demand coming from society at large, and also politically formulated in terms of global warming and in terms of being responsible. And that's been integrated. It's not necessarily, I mean, I've actually written, I'm just publishing an article on this. You know, the way the discipline has, is voluntary, and there are these self-generated initiatives like LEED and BREEAM certification. These are initiatives coming from within the discipline, not even from outside. I mean, within an outside milieu, and I really like that. And a lot of architects have buy-in. And the RBA sets up its own kind of targets within the national framework. So we have a task force in Zalit Architects. It's not reflecting the author process of architecture. That's correct. I'm talking about the relationship between architecture and politics there, and not so much about the relationship between architecture and morality. So, but I do find parametricism, tectonism is very well placed. As I said, a lot of the improvements and things coming out of BREEAM are basically engineering, coming through engineering responsibility, a lot of them, which materials to choose and construction methods, etc., and also the energy saving energy machines and so on. But we have definitely something to contribute. I said that, I think, in one of the previous lectures, when it comes to passive systems and our way to adapt through parametric modeling, and also the tools which even now in Grasshopper, where you can have where you can do model in early feedback in terms of the way of your volumes and distributions perform with respect to sun exposure as well as other energy conditions. So I think it's quite important. And I explicitly said, yes, environmental engineering is one of the drivers which drive tectonism. It's not only structural engineering, it's let's say fabrication and construction. It's environmental engineering very importantly as well. So I want to say that I don't think we need to have but this is not something, the new morality, this is not originating with us. We're just responding to outside conditions. They're a bit more loose and indeterminate than, for instance, political conditions. Moral conditions, you know, they exist, and therefore the relationship is maybe slightly different. Maybe we have to be more take a stance. But again, it's not something which we have to also be very careful about, because I think the clients expect of us the zero carbon thing, and that's the way it should be. Or where they telling us we actually aspiring to lead platinum. I don't think it's for us to judge and force clients or make a moral stance relative to clients that, or refuse jobs if there aren't zero carbon. I don't think that's realistic. So I do think that we have in the side discipline, we have these initiatives and we have these measures, and we have this pride of doing these very good projects, but I wouldn't make it too much of a strong moralizing stance. So that's one thing I wanted to say, but tectonism is very, very well placed. And it is interesting because it's not just a duty, it's actually an exciting project, because this really means climatic, regional, morphological adaptation, asymmetrization, and a lot of actually issues of semiology and legibility issues can positively flow from working with environmental parameters, like we're showing in our Saudi projects, like we're showing in our Baghdad project. So I'm actually very positively attuned to these environmental constraints and what we as architects can do. And then it's the client's decision whether he also wants to do, you know, buy carbon offsets or want to invest extra in recycled concrete, etc. But our task is more in terms of the morphological design elements, where I think it's a congeniality which I view very positively. Now I want to come to OMA and REM also. I mean, REM has been a great influence, and I've learned so much in terms of this. First of all, is the idea of the retroactive manifesto, which make us understand, you know, where we can understand even the way societal, socio-economic forces are absorbed and worked through within architecture, the need for revolutions and redoing this, the looking always at these kind of things which crop up outside the canon, outside what architecture has coped with and worked through, the new thing like the periphery, like you know, strange things happening in Atlanta with these kids designing postmodern towers, and the architects don't even look at them because they think it's all kitsch, or shopping malls. This whole research on shopping, I think there's wonderful research also. There's research on China and these new kind of forms of urbanization. So I think I learned a lot. It's in the spirit of learning from Las Vegas, in the spirit of learning for Manhattan, and he's done many of these research projects. I think that's very important, and also trying always to find what's new and relevant, and it's a functionalist perspective, the perspective of recognizing phenomena which have force and scale and are happening, and the architects not aware of that. There's something fundamentally wrong. We need to kind of look at it and learn and incorporate these tasks and these typologies into our repertoire. And that's what I liked. I mean, and one of the most profound, I mean, there's many profound articles. He also, you know, he has his book, The Delirious New York, but then he has, of course, SMLXL has a series of really profound and wonderful articles. The Generic City is one of them, but also Bigness. Bigness for me is, I think, the article where it's the most congenial. And his understanding of bigness is, you know, these deep, not the skinny towers, not the skinny slabs because of light and breathe, and because they have no much connections. In a tower, you're only by yourself. In a building which is very thin and flat and long, you have only one neighbor on each side. That's it. In a bigness, in a deep, thick, fat volume, you unleash the regime of complexity. That's what he's saying, and that's exciting for me. And he also was a fan of Portman. He visited John Portman in Atlanta, and there's this kind of photos of him and the description of him in his lectures of being up in the spider web. You know, Portman did all these towers with these network of connections, and he has the mega atrium. So there's a lot of things where also to see somebody like Portman, who was dismissed as a kitsch kind of commercial entrepreneur, and seeing the power of that. So I learned enormous amounts from Rem, but bigness is the big thing. Why? Because, for instance, Bibliothèque Nationale was this seminal project which he lost to Dominique Perrault. It's the French National Library. It was a deep, thick volume, and he used it inside where he has these floating carved out voids and strange shapes floating in a volume, and everything has many, many adjacencies and connections. I mean, it's a wonderful project, and it was kind of mind-blowing, and it's very, very interesting. We did also contribute to this project, and I saw the congeniality between Rem and Zaha, because we hadn't noticed this, and we did. I think our project was maybe not as strong, but we did something very similar. We had this volume. It wasn't as in all directions equal, but we had the volume with floating rooms and voids as well, volume within volume thing. So, but he then did the Bibliothèque Nationale, he did the Jussy libraries, he did this, and finally the Seattle libraries, and the bigness is later on the retrospective theoretical article describing the potency of this, the power of this, which is basically about inter-awareness, intervisibility, interconnections, density of connections, and that we have to learn to love these deep volumes. And of course, he also reflected that they're only possible because we have air conditioning, and therefore we can unleash these regimes of complexity. And also the shopping malls have that. You know, how much can you do, and you don't have to. And the modernism, we had the aesthetic of modernism was all about slenderness, right? The thin slab, the small tower. These were the proportions we loved. It wasn't classical proportions, but we liked that long, thin slab. You know, for instance, something like the United Nations slab. These were, and in a sense, this formal approach, these old aesthetic values were dismissing these fat, ugly volumes. And we've totally missed out that the fat, ugly volumes is really what we have to work on, because that's where you can unleash the regime of complexity. And so I love that Rem for that. And there's so many great inspirations. This idea of surfing the wave of looking at reality, challenging architecture and its preconception, but then also how you deal with it. You find the things and you turn them into positive programs. So you make all these observations, and he makes a little OMA copyrighted, and then he phrases notions. And that's the way he wants to see the rationality of the real, which we didn't, the architect, and bring it into architecture and say, he is now he's now the original protagonist who has all these new concepts. But where does he get his concepts from? He gets them out of the raw, ignored reality, And that's a very good way to get them, because we know they're already vital. They know. So it also shows to some extent, I mean, it's maybe an exaggerating this side of the story, that the profession, although I said, you know, it's very important to have theory-led, and you also can make a lot of progress, you observe, but you also miss out a lot. So there's also this kind of bottom-up spontaneous outcroppings outside what the discipline has encompassed, particularly if there's a change, if you know, yes, you know, if history moves slowly forward, and you've took a number of decades, and you finally realize industrial civilization, modernism, you're okay, but then you miss out the next stage. So I really love that with Rem. And by the way, but I have to say, the sensibility of Rem is quite different from mine, ultimately, because he is more of the poet, writer, artist, inverted commas, despite all his focus on the vital outcroppings of the real processes, because he's really interested in that in this kind of strangeness, the surreal strangeness of reality, and he wants to go out and find more and more, and I don't think, and it's the thrill of that discovery of bringing it out, but not necessarily running this, working it, and also then finding new strange things and getting bored rather than working through and wanting to find new things. So I think that this latest attempt to go back to the countryside, I mean, you might like it. I thought it was misguided, or his fascination with these. Yes, you could be fascinated with these huge data centers on the outskirts and dream about a new kind of strange moonscape. But I don't see the relevancy. So I don't think, you know, I don't think that he shifted. You're getting, in a sense, bored with the metropolitan condition of that bigness and hyperdensity, and then say, let me go to the countryside. I'm getting fascinated, because he's just looking for new strange stuff. I don't think he has a red thread and a systematic urge to lead the field or work it through and deliver it. He's much more an artist still. So I think that whole generation of mavericks, I mean, he's less of a maverick than maybe Wolf Briggs, but he still is. He still has this very different drive. Maybe more, he's more of a poet than he would admit.
Great, that's interesting comments from Patrick to OMA. I think we want to.
And Rainier is like this too. You know, Rainier, Grant, they're part each other. He's also he's a poet. He just wants to. And it's more the kind of provocateur. He's more the. He's the eternal avant-gardist. Rem, both Rem and Rainier. And I'm, as you said, I also want to be the mainstream. I want to be, you know, but while we have also our own internal research and continuing avant-gardes, we also want to be the big mainstream. So I'm more of a, in this sense, I'm somehow in between Rem and Foster.
I think the past years we have not only OMA but also Jaha and like the Prix Himmelbro. The word is interesting because have all of you.
You know what I want to? I mean, of course, Rem thought himself. Rem wanted to be another Le Corbusier, and he's very close. And that's also my inspiration, because if you compare Le Corbusier,
you also want to be another.
Look, I want to be continuously innovating as well, but I also want to be big. So Le Corbusier was the first international office. They went out and went everywhere. But you know what I find interesting, if you compare Le Corbusier with Mies and Gropius, so Mies and Gropius both went fully mainstream, and they just want to deliver and roll out their thing with ever more scale and perfection, and fantastic. Le Corbusier was the one who was continuously innovating and changing and making reshifting. You know, white modernism became brutalism, and even in late his life, there's some radical new projects like the Venice Hospital, Met buildings. I mean, that's and still, but he achieved large scale projects well. So he was what I inspired him, being mainstream and avant-garde at the same time. You know, so I think Rem wanted this too, but Rem is much more the avant-gardist than and he doesn't have enough Foster in him. Mies and Foster, I still want some of that.
Yeah, Patrick, it's interesting to make the theory. I think history will have comments to the theory. I think we should wait to see the parametricism. Right now, it's like 15 years. We have a review on the theory, and hopefully after 15 years, maybe like 30 years later of your theory, what will happen? So
I will be around. I will be around. I'll come back.
history will have comments to all the
I come
theory.
back and
Yeah. So thanks a lot for Patrick to your lecture. I think it's a great pleasure to have the 6 lectures as archive, and we put it not only in the library of Tongji University, but also on the website, I think, including the Bilibili and YouTube. This is the history. I think thanks a lot for your contribution to the PhD program. And tomorrow evening, we'll announce Patrick Schumacher will be the fellowship of Digital Futures, which show our respect to your contribution to the community. So thank you so much, Patrick, for your fantastic
thanks. It was a real pleasure. I mean, I enjoyed it, and all the great questions and opportunities. So fantastic. So I see some of you, I guess, in the review at 3 o'clock.
Okay, see you very soon. Yeah.
See you. Bye.
Thank you, Patrick.